For 8 long years, a young soldier was labeled a deserter, his bravery erased by silence and bureaucratic indifference. Those who could have uncovered the truth chose to bury it instead, leaving his name in disgrace. But his loyal companion, Max, carried the memory no one else would. And when the time came, he led David back to the place where it all began. But just wait until you hear how a forgotten grave, a grieving dog, and one final act of loyalty turned injustice into honor. It had been nearly 2 years since Sergeant David Monroe came home from Afghanistan. He lived quietly now, in a modest cabin tucked deep within the hills of Southern Virginia, far from the noise, far from the memories. The only companion he kept was Max, his German shepherd and former military partner. To an outsider, Max was just a dog, but to David, he was the only witness to a chapter of life too heavy to retell. They had survived it all together, dust storms, ambushes, endless nights filled with the unknown. And now they survived the silence. Max had always been more than obedient. He was watchful, loyal. There was a gentleness behind his eyes that only David seemed to understand. Each morning, the dog would follow him from the porch to the edge of the woods and back, his movements precise, his instincts sharp. He didn't bark without reason. He didn't stray without cause. So when Max refused his breakfast one morning, simply stared at the bowl and walked away, David thought little of it. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe just a mood. But then the second day came, and the food was left untouched again. On the third day, Max didn't touch his water either. He didn't wag his tail, he didn't even lift his head when David knelt beside him. He just lay by the back door, eyes locked on the tree line beyond the yard, as if he were waiting for something or someone. David tried everything: chicken broth, car rides, long walks on familiar trails, a visit to the local vet who ran her hands gently over Max's body, checked his vitals, his teeth, his stomach, and found nothing. "He's not sick," she told him with a quiet shrug, "but something's clearly wrong. Maybe it's emotional. Dogs carry things too." That night, David sat beside Max on the old wooden floor, stroking his fur as dusk settled in. The room was dim, the air still, and David couldn't help but wonder if there was something Max remembered that he didn't, something he'd buried, something the dog had carried in silence all this time. The morning of the fourth day, just before sunrise, David was stirred from sleep by a soft sound, a whimper, low and persistent, coming from the back door. He stepped into the kitchen and found Max sitting upright, alert, eyes shining with unusual urgency. Clutched gently between his teeth was a worn leather leash. Max didn't wait for permission. He padded to the door, dropped the leash at David's feet, and looked up at him, not with pleading, but with purpose. David stared down, heart pounding, unsure why his hands trembled as he clipped the leash onto Max's collar. The dog turned immediately and tugged, leading him toward the forest behind the house. No hesitation, no backward glance. There was no doubt anymore. Max wasn't refusing to eat because he was ill. He was remembering something, something buried in that forest, under layers of time and silence. And for the first time in a long while, David followed, not out of habit, but out of instinct. Because whatever called to Max from those woods, it hadn't let go. The leash grew heavy in David's hand, not from Max's weight, but from the sense that each step was leading them somewhere that wasn't just physical. The forest behind the cabin was thick and old, its trees tall and unmoving. David had walked its edge plenty of times, chopped wood, sat by the fire pit, but he hadn't gone deep, not since he came back. Something about it had always made him uneasy, though he could never explain why. That morning, fog threaded between the trunks like breath held in the air. Birds were absent. Even the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot seemed muffled. Max moved with eerie determination, ears up, posture tense, not aggressive, but alert, as if he recognized something in the air that David couldn't name. They passed familiar landmarks, an old pine split by lightning, a dry creek bed, and then deeper, beyond where the land was mapped in David's memory. He didn't speak. He didn't want to disturb the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. After nearly 20 minutes of steady walking, Max slowed. His nose dipped low to the forest floor, circling a patch of damp earth just beneath a leaning oak. Then, suddenly, he dropped to the ground and began a dig. Not like a dog chasing a scent or pawing out a rabbit hole. This was different. Max dug with desperate force, his front paws clawing through dirt and roots with a kind of quiet fury. David's chest tightened as he knelt beside him, brushing Max gently back and taking over. Something in him resisted, as if his own body knew what was coming. The first sound was a soft clunk, his hand striking something silent. David froze. The box was buried just beneath the surface, wrapped in layers of old canvas that tore away like tissue. Its wood was cracked, its edges softened by time and moisture. It wasn't large, but it had weight, the kind of weight memory carries. He hesitated before opening it. The hinges resisted slightly, as if they too had been holding something in. And then, as the lid creaked back, David saw what lay inside, and the forest around him seemed to stop breathing. A pair of military dog tags rested atop a folded strip of faded camouflage cloth. Beside them, a tarnished purple heart, edges dulled but still unmistakable. And beneath them both, a photo. Worn, corner-frayed, edges curled from time. David picked it up carefully, dust falling away from the image like ash. A young man in uniform grinned back at him, arms wrapped tightly around a German shepherd. Not Max, but the resemblance was unmistakable. They were in a camp somewhere, tents in the background, sun high overhead. The boy looked barely 20. David's breath caught. Private Lucas Myers. He remembered him now, the youngest in their unit, always first to volunteer, always scribbling letters home and terrible in writing. David had last seen him during that ambush in the Kandahar Hills. Everything had gone dark and chaotic. Lucas had broken formation, trying to reach someone who'd been injured near the tree line. They never saw him again. The official report was vague, presumed captured or killed in action. That had been 8 years ago. David had never seen any of his personal belongings again. No one had. There had been no body, no funeral, just a photo in the mess hall and a line in the memorial log. And now, here he was, kneeling in the middle of a forest thousands of miles from the battlefield, staring down at a box that should not exist. His hands trembled. Max sat beside him now, still, watching, no longer frantic, as if his job was done, as if the weight he had carried in silence for years had finally been passed on. David looked up at the trees, then back down at the box in his lap. There were too many questions. Why here? Why now? And how long had Max known? The forest around them remained unchanged, but David Monroe knew in his gut that something had shifted. A veil lifted, a thread pulled loose. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. David didn't sleep that night. The box sat on his kitchen table beneath a single flickering light, its contents laid out carefully across an old wool blanket, each item arranged with reverence, not curiosity. The dog tags, the faded photograph, the rusted metal. Each one spoke without words. And Max, ever silent, lay curled nearby, eyes half open, watching his partner from across the room like a sentinel standing final watch. By morning, David picked up the phone. He contacted the sheriff's office first, unsure what exactly he was reporting. An unofficial grave, a lost soldier's belongings, a mystery unearthed by a dog. The woman on the line listened patiently, took down details, and promised to send someone out. Then David called the Department of Veterans Affairs, followed by the Records Division at Fort Bragg. Most of those calls ended in transfers, voicemails, and vague promises to look into it. But one line connected him to a man named Captain Thomas Rourke, an officer who, by chance or providence, had once served in the same theater as David. That changed everything. 2 days later, a government vehicle pulled up outside David's cabin. A quiet investigation began, not by men in suits, but by soldiers in uniform who knew exactly what they were looking at. The box, the location, the name on the tags, and more importantly, the time and place it all pointed to. They traced it back to a specific date in 2017, the final mission of Alpha Squad near the outer boundary of a disputed village known as Varnick Ridge. The official record from that day had always been murky. Lost radio contact, limited satellite visibility, conflicting reports. What the military had recorded was that Private Lucas Myers had broken formation without direct orders. The language was careful. Words like unauthorized movement and possible defection danced around the deeper implication. The truth had been buried not just in the woods, but in paperwork. But Captain Rourke had clearance. And what he uncovered shook even the most hardened officers. A classified mission log, previously sealed under compromised operation protocol, documented that Lucas had seen a wounded child, local, barely 6 years old, bleeding in a collapsed alley during the ambush. His request to retrieve the child had been denied. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. Lucas had gone anyway. He was last seen carrying the child toward the tree line, trying to loop back to safety behind enemy fire. No one followed. No one could. The chaos swallowed him whole. The team pulled back. The logs ended. And just like that, he vanished from history. No rescue, no recovery, no confirmation. The file was closed with the label MIA, quiet, clean, forgotten. But now, with the box unearthed and GPS coordinates matching the site where Max had led David, an evidence team returned to the forest. Ground-penetrating radar revealed shallow soil disruption beneath the oak tree. Human remains were recovered, fragile, time-worn, but intact enough for DNA analysis. 2 weeks later, the confirmation arrived. It was him. Private First Class Lucas Myers. He hadn't run. He hadn't defected. He hadn't vanished in shame or dishonor. He had died doing what he believed was right, trying to save a life when others turned away. And someone, a villager, perhaps the same family Lucas tried to protect, had found him, buried him gently, placed the box beside him like a prayer made of wood and memory. 8 years of silence. 8 years of questions, of assumptions, of erasure. And now, with the help of a dog who had never spoken a word but remembered everything, the truth had surfaced. David stood by the forest's edge that evening, watching the trees sway under a golden sky. Max sat beside him, calm, steady. No one had expected this, but perhaps the forest had never forgotten. And Max, he had simply waited for the world to be ready to remember.
For days after the confirmation came in, David found himself sitting in silence, running the memories backward. Dusty roads, checkpoint radios, the sudden chaos of the ambush that had turned order into confusion. And somewhere in that storm, Max had vanished. At the time, no one had questioned it. The unit was scattered, visibility was poor, and Max was a trained service dog. He knew how to survive. He reappeared 2 days later, limping, ribs bruised, his side scraped raw. The medics treated him. The reports moved on. The mission ended. But now, pieces clicked into place, pieces that had been there all along. David remembered Max pacing at night after that ambush. He remembered how the dog had stayed near Lucas's bunk, even after it was cleared out. How he would sit facing the tree line long after they'd returned to base, eyes locked on the distance. No one had paid attention. They had chalked it up to stress, noise, instinct. But it hadn't been instinct. Max had seen something. He had followed Lucas into the trees. And though he'd returned wounded and silent, he had carried that moment with him for years, anchored deep in his memory like a mission left unfinished. Now, as age slowed his stride and silver prepped across his muzzle, Max had found the strength to speak in the only way he knew how. Not through noise, but through action. He had waited, he had watched, and when the time came, he led David back to where the truth had waited with patient roots and soft earth. The discovery made headlines quickly. It started local. Veteran's dog leads him to long-lost soldier's grave. But soon, national outlets picked up the story. Not because of the sensational nature of it, but because of what it revealed. The military reviewed Lucas Myers's file in full. The sealed documents were declassified. The label MIA was changed. The line suggesting disobedience was struck out. And in its place, a new entry was written. Killed in action, in the act of rendering aid. Lucas's name was restored. His legacy returned. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. A formal apology was issued to his family, who had spent nearly a decade wondering if their son had died in shame. Now they knew. He had died in honor. A full military funeral was arranged. David stood among the ranks in pressed uniform, Max by his side, grayer now, but steady. The funeral was held at Arlington. Folded flags, a 21-gun salute, boots lined beside a rifle, a sea of quiet faces. The photograph from the box, Lucas hugging the dog who had never forgotten him, was placed near the casket, framed in walnut and shadow. Lucas's name was etched onto the wall of honor, beneath the words service, courage, sacrifice. And in that solemn space of marble and silence, something unspoken found its voice again. David didn't say much to the reporters. He let the story speak for itself. He knew some would call it unbelievable, coincidental, even poetic. But he had seen Max's eyes the day he found that box. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't luck. It was memory. It was loyalty, unbroken, unwavering, and stronger than time. And now, because of it, Lucas was no longer lost. The morning air held a light chill as David stepped into the clearing, the grass beaded with dew that caught the sun like small, patient stars. The new headstone stood where the oak's roots pressed close to the surface, the stone a clean plane of gray against the green. Someone from the county had said it 2 days earlier, after the family and the service members agreed that Lucas's resting place should remain here, where he had been found, where the truth first drew breath again. The ceremony at the cemetery had been formal and grand. This place was intimate. This place was the truth. Max walked at David's side with deliberate calm, his gait slower now, but even, his eyes clear. When they reached the headstone, he stopped without prompting and sat, upright, steady, the way he had stood for roll calls and briefings years ago. The breeze lifted the leaves and then fell silent as a single clear note from a trumpet rose in the distance. A neighbor's son had offered to play. The melody floated between trees, soft and spare, like a promise kept. David leaned close and whispered, "You remembered when we forgot." He didn't say anything else. There was nothing to add. The music did the speaking, and the headstone held the answer. Max didn't wag his tail. He didn't whine. He didn't glance around. He stared ahead, posture firm, ears steady, eyes shining, an old soldier's stance. The sound of taps thinned and faded into the quiet, a final note hanging on the air before slipping into the leaves. They stayed until the sun rose high enough to warm the stone. David set a small offering at its base, the printed copy of the photograph from the box, Lucas in uniform, laughing, arms wrapped around a German shepherd, and a single sprig of rosemary, clipped that morning from the herb bed by the cabin door. Memory and grace. That felt right. In the weeks that followed, the cabin settled into a different kind of stillness. Not the tight, breathless quiet of waiting, but a clean, restful kind. Max began eating again, not voraciously, not like before, but enough. He slept deeply, often choosing the rug by the back door where the evening light lay in wide gold strips. Some afternoons he would ask to go to the clearing, and David would take him. They never stayed long. Max would circle once, press his muzzle gently to the ground between the oak and the headstone, then lie down with his head on his paws. It felt less like visiting and more like belonging. On the last day, dawn came pale and gentle. David woke before the alarm and found Max asleep at the foot of the bed, curled in a loose crescent, chest lifting in an easy rhythm. The room had that soft, early light that mutes every edge. David sat on the floor beside him and rested a hand in the thick fur at his neck. He stayed like that for a long time, listening to the slow tide of breath. When it quieted, it did so the way evening slips into night, without fuss, without fear, just a graceful yielding. There was no struggle, no sound, only peace. He waited a while before moving. He didn't need to look at the clock. Time felt larger than numbers just then. Later that morning, David wrapped Max in the wool blanket he used on winter nights, a blanket that still carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke, and lifted him gently into the truck. The drive to the clearing was short and unhurried. The sky was a high, steady blue, the kind that can hold any weight without breaking. At the edge of the trees, he paused and looked up. "Come on, partner," he said softly, the words more breath than speech. He had prepared the place the day before without knowing why. Cleared a small patch beside Lucas's headstone, lined it with smooth stones from the creek bed, set aside a simple wooden marker he'd planed and sanded until it was satin smooth beneath his palms. He worked with care, each motion unhurried and exact, a kind of quiet ceremony in itself. When the earth was closed again, he laid Max's collar on top, a circle of worn leather and metal that had guided 2 lives through storms and back to shore. Between the 2 graves, he set the wooden plaque. He'd spent the previous evening carving the letters at the kitchen table, each stroke deliberate, each curve a kept promise. The words were plain and final and true. They never left him. David stepped back and let the words anchor themselves in the space, the way stones take their rightful shape in a riverbed. He planted a ring of native wildflowers around the plaque, blue phlox and black-eyed Susan, quiet color for the warm months, seed and sleep for the cold. He pressed his hand to the oak's rough bark and felt, through wood and root, a steadiness that seemed older than sorrow and deeper than joy. For a long while he sat on the ground between the 2 markers, knees drawn up, arms on his thighs, shoulders loose. He spoke in a low voice, the way one speaks to friends who do not need details. He thanked Max for pulling when he refused to see. He thanked Lucas for stepping forward when others had to hold the line. He promised to carry their names the way they had carried him, without ceremony, without boasting, just by living in a way that honors the quiet. As the sun slipped toward the hill, warm light washed the clearing and set the headstone edges aglow. A woodpecker tapped somewhere beyond the rise. A single hawk made a slow, circling stitch through the sky. The world went on, but it felt newly true, as if a missing page had found its binding and settled into place. In the evenings that followed, David kept a simple ritual. He brewed tea, opened the back door, and let the cool air drift through the cabin. Sometimes he spoke aloud, sometimes he didn't. On the table sat the framed photo of Lucas and the shepherd from years ago, and beside it, Max's leash, coiled like a cord of memory. When he finally slept, he slept well. The kind of rest that comes when the hardest part is finished and the story knows its ending. People came by on certain weekends, Lucas's parents, a few soldiers from the old unit, the neighbor boy with the trumpet. They stood in silence, left small tokens, brushed leaves from the plaque. No speeches, no broadcasts, just presence. The kind that doesn't ask for answers because the answer is already here, set into the ground with care. Sometimes, on his way back from the clearing, David would find himself standing at the threshold of the cabin, hand on the doorframe, feeling that brief ache that always follows gratitude. It wasn't loneliness, it was recognition. The good kind, the kind that says, you were loved well. You loved well in return. Seasons would change. The flowers would flare and fade, seed and rise. The oak would shed its leaves and grow new ones. On certain mornings, mist would gather low and thin as silk, and the clearing would look like a memory made visible. On other days, the light would be so clear that every letter on the plaque would appear freshly cut. And if a passerby ever paused at the edge of the woods and asked about the 2 markers and the simple wooden line between them, David would smile with that quiet, steady warmth that grief and gratitude share. He would say their names. He would tell the simple version of the story. He would watch as understanding softened the questioner's face. Then he would walk them to the plaque and let them read the words for themselves. They never left him. A promise kept, a mission finished, a silent salute that lives on.